I hope to show that these two acute magical minds, different in their techniques and detail of belief, but were pioneering sexologists. They knew and amused each other, they corresponded, and helped to liberate and loosen sexual mores through using a deeply esoteric filter, which is reasonably unusual in the West. You have it a lot in the Eastern systems, you don't have it over here. Women have been massively important in the mapping of the emotions and mending them. Jung's women are classic examples of this. They did the work, he took the headlines, by the way, but that's a whole other rant and a whole other talk. But there's still the all too familiar perception that is an active male, passive female. Dion Fortune was trained, Crowley was self-taught. They drew on their occult contacts to develop people and used similar structures to know that they were progressing in an orderly fashion, really. Crowley enjoyed long friendships with clever women. He tended to use women for his sex magic operations and men for sexual pleasure, preferably little Arab boys. Dion Fortune believed that women can have male psyches as her way of allowing the duality within herself. In her esoteric science, she says that individuality is two-sided, positive and negative, a kinetic aspect and a static aspect. So it's male and female, or female and male, according to the force and form of the makeup. Personality is one-sided and has a defined sex. It's the individuality that is a magnet and with plus and minus poles. And the pole inserted determines the sex of the body that is built around it. It depends on relative force in the subtlest planes. So two people who are male and female on Earth are constantly shifting their polarities on the inner planes. If there's a great imbalance, the woman will become male. To give strength to the situation, to create balances of male and female is always relative. And that's very bold and very, sensible and very realistic of her. I think that it's often the case with people like us that we all step in and act appropriately for the situation in any of the worlds, really, even if it's stereotypically or socially wrong that we should act like men or men should act like women. People like us, who are cleverish, capable, and dedicated, so that others, non-occultists, don't know where to place us. We don't come across as all tits and teeth on the pagan scene particularly, yet there is a deeper femininity and sexuality than they can quite feel at home with very often. Some regard independent women as lesbians even in this day and age, and it's something that is lazily said about Dion Fortune. What these two people are, and the third person I'll introduce later, they were the sexologists. They are universally known as fuckologists in the trade, and that was coined by a guy called John Money. He also introduced the concept of gender as late as the 1950s. He kind of invented that, if you like, formally. He was a controversial sexologist. Some people say that he was a trailblazing scientist and sexual liberator, others that he was a fraud and a pervert. And they will always say that about all people who have anything to do with any sort of sexual activity. As well as proving that gender is pliable, he renamed the sexologists the fuckologists. I think it's often... So, there's a third person I'd like to introduce, and that's Mari Stopes, who most people have not heard of anymore, but we would and wouldn't be here if it weren't for her. She was the pioneer of birth control. She was also the pioneer of mutual orgasms for people before the First World War. She was a monster. An absolutely formidable woman, lacking in modesty, sensitivity, spirituality, and she had the brain the size of a planet. She was utterly ghastly, but we do have an awful lot to thank her for. Now at least her books telling how sex should be, as I say, for mutual satisfaction. And this was to the poor, dirty, unwashed people. This was for the people who had 13 kids as standard. Now we are either, if we're lucky, the products of Planned Parenthood, and if not, we're a failure of contraception. That's why we're all here. She gave us that option, basically, but people didn't know that she was an advocate of eugenics. and that she believed that the poor shouldn't be allowed to breed, which is why they needed to know about her work, and that we didn't want these snotty-nosed, snivelling, rickety, TB-infested little creatures representing our country, the white races, in war. We needed decent, strong men built to go to war and die for England. So, as I say, she was a rum old one, she was really. And, that we would never win with illiterates, she thought. In the 1920s, Dr. Beatrice Hinkle, Jung collaborated with her rather than her with him. She wrote about the double standards that women were no longer prepared to live in the false role of morality that men had never lived up to. Women had broken away from the automatic economic servitude, and it allowed them the freedom to begin to discover what it meant to be an individual human being, one with a mind and with an earning capacity. She went on to say that the recent changes in the sexual field were being produced by women. They are taking place in full view with no apologies and with little hesitation. They appear, therefore, most striking and disturbing. Women are reactive agents in the field of sexual morality, and men are the passive, almost bewildered accessories to the overthrow of their long and firmly organised control of women's sexual conduct. As the presumption had always been that women have the emotions as their special province, it therefore falls to them to test the moral values involving sexual behaviour. Men remain jokey and obscene about sex. Women in the 20s were inarticulate about their feelings as newly emancipated people, as they simply didn't have the vocabulary, but they were doing the work and they were living the lives of it. So I think we'll go mad. Yes, that's Mari Stopes. Right. So I could talk about various people. I could talk about Ida Craddock, who was an American in the 1860s. I mean, she was fairly crazy, and she eventually took her life rather than go to prison again. But her husband was an angel, and he dictated amazing stuff on the sexual organs and how to have sex from beyond. But she came to fame when in the World's Fair in Chicago, I think it was in the 1860s, they had belly dancers. And these were ladies who wore skirts down to their ankles, they wore muslin trousers underneath them, they wore muslin shifts on top of their pretty boleros and all the rest of it, but because it was an ancient form of female expression, people went absolutely crazy. There was one man in particular who hunted and haunted anything at all to do with sex, and he was a postmaster, the Postmaster General, and he proudly said that 4,000 people had gone to jail because of him, because of the smut that they had produced, and that there were 15 suicides because of him. But these ladies who did the belly dancing, they moved people, they were strange, there was an eroticism to it, but they were just expressing an ancient form of female sexuality. I could talk about Edward Carpenter. He was the homosexual communist who lived in a commune with his sandals and his socks and his hipster beard. His sandals have been preserved for the nation. Could talk about Havelock Ellis, who also had a very long, white, bushy beard. He wrote the most important book on sexual psychology in the 19th century, in all 7 volumes of it, The Study of Psychology of Sex. But it only dealt with the abnormal, the aberrant, all 7 volumes, as I say. It's possible because he married a lesbian who left him at the after the civil ceremony and went back to her lesbian lover to live with her. It's possible because he could only get an erection when he saw women urinate. Not in a golden showers fun kind of a way, but just when he saw women having a pee. I could talk about W.T. Stead, who was a friend of Annie Besant, the co-mason and one of the very heavily involved with theosophy. He famously bought a 13-year-old girl for £5 and took her to a brothel for the night, just to show that he could, and to show that the police did nothing at all to protect children. And they still don't really, do they, particularly? This is a talk about Dion Fortune and Crowley as our pioneer sexologists, but I have to put them in context, and as I say, the ghastly Mari Stopes hoses into view. I drone on endlessly with all these kids doing PhDs, and I drone on about context, and she spearheaded a global revolution in sexual matters through contraception, sexual technique, and sexual diseases. She was anti the diseases. Her 4 books have sold over millions and millions of copies, I mean tens of millions of copies. She didn't have a spiritual bone in her body, and no way was she an occultist. Well, she did have a lesbian lover who was the theosophist, and God did tell her to write to the Church of England bishops and let them know that he had spoken through her as she was his prophet, but really I doubt that he did. Right, next one. It amazes me that so many people regard Crowley, because everybody knows everything about Crowley, obviously. So, you know, I will spend time on him, but you know it all already, obviously. And how they regard it, what they regard about him is still based on John Simon's The Great Beast, the biography written by this young journalist who was out on the make. He couldn't say, especially as he didn't believe it, that Crowley was wonderful in all his ways and that his sexual teachings were just what post-war Britain needed. But he did a News of the World style, well, we feel you should know this, dear reader, version of the man. He damned him with faint praise and exaggerated the bad bits. Crowley was appalling in many ways, but he was also devoted to the enhancement of people's lives through their discovery of their true will. He helped them to shuck off the then Victorian prurience about sex, the low self-esteem that a tremendous number of people still have, and then find out and live by what made them happy. He's condemned for things that an awful lot of us have done now, especially openly amongst our generation, and that of our children, although our parents did it too, but with guilt. Dion Fortune says of him, although Crowley's writings are marred by the grossest ribaldry and the foulest personal abuse, they are the works of a man of genius and a writer of magnificent English. To speak any word in mitigation of the general condemnation of Crowley is a thankless task, for the panic-stricken people immediately concludes that one is in league with the devil. All right, next one, please. There we are, the lad himself. He had 1 million sexual partners, he took drugs, he travelled, he read a lot, he wrote a lot, he did magic a lot, sex magic in particular, he did extreme sports, he lived beyond his means, he tried to help people, except he did it all on a vast scale. Do any of us fit onto that list? I suspect we do all of those, So what, in a way, except that he was open about it. He was a very, very brave and early out gay poet. He was, he was important in lots and lots and lots of ways. And he was the showman. He was the stealer of the fire from heaven. He was that Promethean figure that all movements need. It doesn't matter how many worthy people there are. It's the people with character that you need to get whatever it is you're talking about remembered. He was brought up in the very narrow Christian sect, the Plymouth Brethren, and it was a real thou shalt not interpretation of Jesus and all his works. They believe even now that newspapers and computers are stovepipes of filth and should not be used or read. And they had a leader called Obadiah something, if my memory serves, and he got deposed because his treatment of young girls was too bad even for them. He had to go about 10 years ago. They also believe that however bad your sins, all will be forgiven you when you get to the pearly gates. So there is no responsibility in this life in real terms at all. And Crowley certainly lived by that. God will ultimately forgive you however badly you treat your fellow man. Crowley was a devoted boy, but rebelled and spent the rest of his life not blaming other people, doing the he made me thing, but analysed his shortcomings and tried to educate the people into the fact that so much of our mean and petty behaviours are learnt responses, which again is really, quite forward thinking for the time. His mother had a second child, a daughter, and she only lived for a couple of hours. Postnatal depression was unknown of then, and Crowley writes vilely about her, but she was always almost a daily fixture and fit in his life until she died in 1917 when he was 42. We're more fortunate than him in that we were the official teenagers and hormones had been invented. It's a ghastly stage where you're too young to do what you want to do and you're too old to do what you used to do. Crowley had just growing pains. His father died of cancer of the throat after a year of electric treatment and homeopathy that had failed, so that the prayers of his earnest son had also failed, and his son, Crowley, was taken out of school to add to his strength with family prayers. He then went to hell in a handcart, and he went from this liberal, pleasant religious fanatic of a father who spread the word and meant it and was kind and humorous and all the rest of it. He then came in the care of his wicked uncle Tom Bishop, who came from a more narrow sect than the Plymouth Brethren. He came from the Derbyites. And really, this is like saying the Glastonburyans and the Wellesians. You know, they're that close to each other, and it's just the name of the person who set up one particular schism and went on from there. You know, the witches had it with Gardner and Alexandrianism. It's a similar sort of thing. But everybody but them was wrong. That's the important thing about it. There's a religious sect in Canada called the Do Boys or something like that. And every now and again, they think that they should live in Canada without paying tax, without the kids having to go to school, that they shouldn't have to pay for their food, I think, and that nothing it applies to them that applies to everybody else. And if something happens locally that annoys them, a couple of thousand of them will go into the local town, take off all their clothes and set fire to houses and shops and things as a protest. But Christ works in strange ways. So as I say, Uncle Tom was a vicious, you know, he really was a religious bigot. His father was a religious bigot, but with a smile on his face, really. And famously, Crowley caught clap from a Glasgow prostitute when he was 15. He also seduced a maid in his mother's bed, and he was found out, and he lied about that. But I haven't brought the quote with me, but he wrote quite nicely about that, the event, actually. Right, next. This is the young Alec. He discovered the company of clever men in his teens, and they were the early mountaineers in Scotland. And I mean, that was like being an early skateboarder. It was really funky. It was terribly, terribly new. They were he went to Scotland, he went to Switzerland, and he liked them, and they liked him. And Crowley was ill variously for most of his life, but he was at his fittest then. He was active, and he could breathe in the mountain air, and he had just an absolutely fabulous time of it. And when he went up to Cambridge, he was free, white and 20, and had his third of the family fortune. He spent it well and fast. The family, because he'd been such a vile teenager, wouldn't give him any money. He had to send all the bills to the trust fund. So he duly did that, but whenever he bought books, which he said by the ton, but I suspect only by the hundredweight, he would immediately sell them back to the bookseller at a loss, so that he then got the cash. So he got it both ways. He fell in love for the first time with a man who worked as a female impersonator, and they were quite unsuited in many, many ways. But Pollock was always acknowledged by Crowley as the man who made a poet of him in the 6 months that they lived together as man and wife. Aleister became Alice, and later, during his affair with the young Victor Neuburg, he in turn made him a poet. By working with him homosexually. Homosexuality was illegal in Britain until we know, living memory. It was in the 1950s that somebody dared stand up in court and say, yes, I committed a homosexual act. Until then, it was indecent exposure or whatever. It took the 1950s for the guy to stand up and say, yes, I'm a homosexual, and yes, I did that thing. So, And as I say, it was illegal in quite some part of Europe as well, until common sense and the law met up variously over the last 50 years. The slogan of to keep the Bible and the government out of the bedroom is a very, very good one. And so he went on his merry way. He tried or did get married a couple of times, usually for respectability in part. He had long friendships with clever women, but his marriages were usually sort of slightly rocky parts of his life. The first engagement was in Paris, which was to Eileen Gray, the noted furniture designer and interior designer, who is too little ignored. There are various poems to her in things like the collected works. Very important. Well, anyway, that's another story. I'm diverting myself, really. And then he famously married Rose Kelly, and lastly Maria de Miramar, the Nicaraguan firebrand. Rose Kelly was, next slide. Rose Kelly was his daughter. He was the vicar of Camberwell in southeast London. He had a living of £1,600 a year. Booth, who did the Salvation Army man, who did all the recording of the streets and colour-coded them for red for poor and yellow for affluent and all the rest of it, said that he seemed a very pleasant man. He was quite concerned about his congregation. He has a very nice Gilbert Scott church. Oddly enough, I nearly bought the vicarage there years ago, but that's another story. She isn't the innocent that people say, young Rose, his daughter. His son became a noted portrait painter, Sir Gerald Kelly, got knighted for it, and he rather liked doing young paintings of young Thai girls. They were his speciality, and society. He was very much a social climber, was our Gerald, and it seems. But anyway, Rose, his sister that he married, she was a widow when she met Crowley, and she was in a predicament, as she explained to him, that two men loved her. One had gone back to South Africa to ask her dad for enough money to marry her. The other one had gone back to America to earn enough money to marry her. The deal was in those days that if you were a married woman, of course you could have a gentleman caller. That was fine. If you were a woman alone, then you could not. So she famously said to her parents that she needed £40 for an abortion, when really she didn't. She just wanted to take her friends to dinner and buy a new dress. That
was a more plausible story.
Yeah. She later, took to drink. Living with Crowley, I think any of us would have done, but she took to drink. He always said that she got it from her mother, the dipsomania. We'll never know, really. They had an extended honeymoon. She got pregnant, as most wives did on their extended honeymoons. They travelled extensively, as you know. The child died, as you know. Crowley divorced her. But before that, when she had the second child she was pregnant with, he named that after his current mistress. When he divorced her, he and Neuberg took the child with them, travelling through North Africa. Can you imagine that? An Edwardian couple of gay guys travelling with a toddler. It must have been awful at home. Absolutely awful at home. The cure for alcoholism in those days was 2 years in a lunatic asylum. Anyway, when he divorced her, she eventually married one of his friends, and they just really worked their way through the wine cellar then. Why he is here is because this saintly vicar, Crowley wrote Snowdrops from a Curate's Garden to keep her amused while they were pregnant. And it's about their sex lives, basically. And, just as something to amuse her. But her brother Gerald helped Crowley edit it. Now, I still think that's off. I struggle with that one, So, right. And next, there we have Rose Kelly. And it does look as if she's forgotten to put her petticoat on. I've never really studied the picture closely enough, but as I say, she's not the innocent little lamb that people thought she was. She was, without doubt, she was wronged by Crowley. But, they just hit it off initially, and then it all went pear-shaped, but that happens endlessly. His next one was Leah Hirsig, the next woman that mattered. I mean, there were dozens in between, obviously. And she was Swiss-born and had a violent alcoholic for a father, and she was brought up in New York, where she produced a son and earned a living as a teacher. She and Crowley had a primal attraction for each other, really. And he wrote vile things about Jews in a feeble attempt at humour, usually. But she was a Jewess, and he never wrote anything unpleasant about her Jewishness at all. And she did have they did have a sadomasochistic relationship. And his great mate, William Seabrook, wrote, "Imagine, if you will," this is New York 1919 in Washington Square. "Imagine, if you will, an immense room hung with oriental tapestries, enormous divans on the floor covered with dull cloth of gold, Eastern images, idols and statues everywhere, some exquisitely beautiful, some hideous beyond belief. There was a girl there, Leah Hirsig, pretty but dressed with the utmost quietness and dignity, with a face that seemed a bit sad and a bit disdainful. She said something. Crowley stared at her with an actorish intensity and said, 'You have spoken, but I am Baphomet, and by my power your dead soul shall wake. You are Leah of the dead soul. By my power you shall become Leah the Scarlet Woman.' Mr. Crowley, you're absurd. You've no power over me. I'm not interested in your absurd pretensions." Crowley recited a formula in a secret Hindu dialect for less than a minute. She said nothing more to him but stayed the night. 4 days later, Seabrook returned to an amazing scene. Leah was kneeling in the centre of a chalked circle in the middle of the floor, barefoot like a penitent nun, clad only in a loose robe drawn back over her shoulders, and Aleister Crowley was bending over her, burning magical symbols onto her chest with a heated dagger. Why didn't I interfere? Why didn't I call the police? Well, partly because he was a sadist, but I'll come on to him in a minute. She was not bound or held in any physical way. She could have stopped it by raising her voice once. She wasn't drugged or in a stupor. She was obviously in pain, but it was equally obvious she was where she wanted to be. The girl must have suffered, but she didn't make a single murmur until he'd finished. And then, with his help, she got to her feet and retired to an adjoining room. She emerged after an hour and chatted inconsequentially and said how she hoped Seabrook would drop by again soon. He saw her there in the studio in Washington Square. In fact, let's try the next one. Yes. There we are. He saw her again in the studio in Washington Square, and she lay on the divan of cloth of gold like a princess in the Arabian Nights, dressed in robes of purple silk, her little white feet encased in slippers of scarlet. I'm happier than I'd ever dared hope. Sometime after that, Seabrook visited Crowley's study, and there was a huge artist's easel, big like a scaffold. On it, bound hand and foot, was Leah, with her dress torn away at the shoulders and her flesh crisscrossed with red stripes. I've been wakening a dead soul, said his host. She doesn't object, ask her if you want. The efficacy of pain as a spiritual stimulus is a subject misunderstood and neglected by modern woman. He launched into a learned discourse on the importance of the ascetics of whipping and fasting. Leah became his Scarlet Woman and was the first person to actually challenge Crowley. She said, okay, if you can speak Chinese, speak it. For a day, for a week. If you can do this, then prove it to me. I want physical manifestations of stuff. She called his bluff like nobody had ever done before, and that was part of her allure for him, I think, really. She was also his goad and guiding light at Cefalù, the Abbey of Thelema. When he tired of her and installed a new Scarlet Woman, her heart broke, and she magically married another acolyte, Norman Mudd, and sold her body for food as a sacred act. She eventually went back to teaching and died in Switzerland. Now, I think next one, this is William Seabrook. Adventurer, right? It's terribly on topic having this, but yeah, right, okay. Crowley, he was an American, he was an adventurer, a journalist, an author. He won the Croix de Guerre in the First World War, and he was a cannibal, right? Yes. Now, this is very on topic because in the last week or so, somebody has produced a flesh burger. And they haven't used real-life human flesh, but they have used Seabrook's descriptions of human flesh to get the taste right. So he was a sort of Bruce Willis, you know. He was too ugly to be Brad Pitt, but he was a bit of an all-round superhero, really. He was a swashbuckler, as they used to say. He travelled in Africa, but he didn't think that the cannibal chief's description of human flesh was good enough. So when he got back to Paris, he bought himself a new, fresh corpse, and he fried some meat, he boiled some, and he stewed the poor man, and had a few meals off him. He went to Arabia and was with the Druze and in Haiti with for his voodoo, and he introduced the general public to the concept of zombies. His books are very readable because they're just preposterous adventure tales, but you know, really quite brilliant in lots of ways. He was also, of course, an alcoholic, and he eventually volunteered himself to be committed to an asylum to help cure it. His wife, because yes, he had one, eventually divorced him because of his alcoholism and sadism. And then eventually he committed suicide. Next one. Crowley famously gave away the secret of secrets of the OTO in his Book of Lies. He said sex was the secret. And John Simons says, what is this sexual magic that the high-grade Mason Carl Kellner had learned from an Arab and Indian yogis, and which Crowley had discovered for himself, or learnt from his guru in Madras, Subhapati Swami? It is the ritual of the Varmacharis, or followers of the left-hand path, so called because their worship is performed with women who are lunar, or of the left. The figure of man and woman coupled in sexual union is not thought impure by most Indians. On the contrary, it's considered a veritable sacrificial rite. The worshipper is an an attitude towards the woman which is different from an ordinary person performing the sexual act. Besides, the woman isn't usually the man's wife. But whether she is or not, she's not thought of as a woman as such, but as a symbol of divinity, of the Divine Mother. As Arthur Avalon, Sir John Woodruff, wrote, "Those in the East who practice the form of worship which involves sex do not approach the subject from the point of view of ordinary consciousness. They are in fact yogis, men who can call forth in themselves kundalini, which is likened to a serpent, that supreme power in the human body, through the arousing of which yoga, or unity with God, is achieved. The woman too is on the same plane. Together they partake of the feast of the 5 elements, in the frame of mind which is not earthly but mystical. The 5 elements of the 4 Western occult tradition, fire, air, water and earth, represented respectively by wine, flesh, fish and cereals, and the 5th element of spirit or ether, the purpose of which is to synthesize or purify the 4 elements already mentioned. This 5th element is symbolized by the union of Shiva and Shakti, and on the earthly plane by sexual union." Right, that's enough of Crowley for the time being. On to good old Dion Fortune. In 1875, Mary Baker Eddy gave birth to Christian Science, and Mrs. Crowley had her little boy. Dion Fortune's mother became a great believer in Christian Science, and that illness is being illusory, and it will go away if you pray hard enough. So by the time Dion Fortune's 14-ish, she's heavily into a strange sect, as it were. Crowley's brought up in one as well. Anyway, the Christian Scientists believe that man and the universe are spiritual rather than material, and that nature in nature, and that good and truth are real. Evil and error are elusive products of fictitious material existence. If you want me, I'll reread that. But basically, this world is an illusion. So when Dion Fortune used the family motto of Deus non fortuna, she was echoing those years by being by God, not fortune. She didn't learn her magic. She retrieved it after all. Fantastic medium, Dion Fortune. Her work is divided into wonderful novels which read like a charm, and there's still nothing to compare with them for building up to doing some magic with somewhere where your mate suddenly is the living embodiment of a particular aspect of something. There's nobody else that you know, or somebody appears, who could just be more perfect for it. Her other stuff is very, very, very hard to read. All her stuff is dated. It was written a damn long time ago. But the other stuff, the esoteric philosophy of love and marriage and things like that, they must have been channeled because they're not in English as we know them. And they're all the more interesting because of that. She, like Aleister Crowley and Marie Stopes, was an only child, and she was born and died almost at once. Her mother held the baby for a long watch through the night and managed to bring her back to life. She was told this many years later when her mum said that she knew that she wasn't the same child that she'd given birth to, that she was a changeling. Her teenage poetry was published, and she grew up. Next one. And when World War I started, young Violet Firth went off to a college for young ladies to study market gardening in Studley Castle in Warwickshire. And this is where she encountered some diabolical treatment. The warden used a brainwashing technique to break her spirit. And after 4 hours of being told, "You are incompetent and you know it, and you have no self-confidence and you've got to admit it," she cracked, as any of us would. And we're a lot older than she was at the time. She begged forgiveness. She promised never to upset her boss again, and then she slept for 30 hours. One of her friends there who'd gone through the same thing said, "Don't apply to be released from here. She'll never let you go. You've got to make your own escape." And so she did that, and she basically then was fairly much a court case for the next couple of years. It took her a long, long, long time to recover from that. It was brutal. The woman had learnt the stuff in India and had only brought the bad bits back, really. But then she set about finding what had happened in real terms by signing up for a 3-year course in the very new science of psychology. And she went to the Medical Psychological Institute in Tavistock Square, That's the inside of Studley Castle. My daughter stayed there actually, and she said it's a bit conference centre-ish. It wouldn't take much to make it softer and prettier and pleasanter, but the bones of the building are there and still very, very attractive. Next one. This is Tavistock Square, and that's where she went to the Medical Psychological Institute in Tavistock Square, and she's and it set about re-educating its clients. You couldn't qualify in those days as a psychologist. What she did was endless courses, absolutely endless courses. By the time she was 23, she was the highest paid female psychiatrist in London. And when you see the drive that the woman had, and the intelligence that the woman had, and the sympathy that she had as well, you can quite see that that did work. And that, that she could have been that. Sexuality and its many urges were not discussed in polite society, and guilt was automatically associated with any desire. The Freudian release of such anxieties about the sexual instinct led to unlimited self-abuse, she observed. She tried to awaken her clients to the idea of the sacredness of sex, that there is an emotional as well as a physical aspect to it. It was here she met her Dr. Moriarty, Dr. Taverner, and began to develop her natural psychism. Popular and busy, but dissatisfied with not being able to help with what was really going on for people. She worked with Moriarty to use alternative methods to help people, and again, read the books. They're just really quite fantastic. She specialised in habitual masturbators. Now, hold on, I don't know if that's important or not. Bear with me. One day I will have my mouse, my slides and my notes all in the same order, and I will faint. When she eventually got married, and she published Esoteric Philosophy of Love and Marriage in 1924. By then, 25% of married couples lived permanently separated, 50% lived together without love, and 25% were happy. And nowadays, we've got the starter marriage. Even the Archers have got a starter marriage. Everybody but you knows when you're young and silly that the love won't last forever, that, that real life is going to kick in, and you're highly unlikely to go through everything together, because our personalities develop, we function differently, we age and we die. It's to give a form to individuality, and it evolves each time. Esoteric science then understood that sex had emotional and psychological and physical aspects. Esoterically, there are mental and spiritual aspects too. Sex is the life force. Even Germaine Greer said that the élan vital and sex were, the governors of life. It's the divine in nature. Fortune defined it as an energy of an electrohydraulic type, a radiating and magnetizing vibratory activity similar to electricity, which it is very closely related, yet capable of compression and of exercising pressure after the type of water power. I told you this was difficult. I told you it was channeled, and it's nothing to do with me. One force seeking to expand itself and achieve a state of equilibrium, and the other, the latter, the female force, may be compared to the charge of dynamite, whose particles energy is stored up, latent. The male force, or blow of a hammer, releases that latent energy. Pass. Study it. It kind of makes sense, but it doesn't read well. Next one. There she is. Now, she may have been no oil painting. She may have been sturdy with thick ankles and sensible shoes. But I can truthfully say that that's never held me back, as I've said more than once. Crowley rejoiced in the celebration of the sexual polarities, as she did, and their cosmic and natural interplay. In the Book of the Law, chapter 2, verse 24, from the Nerds, women are referred to as magnificent beasts of women with large limbs and fire and light in their eyes and masses of flaming hair about them. Before that, in chapter 1, when Nuit speaks, she says, "But to love me is better than all things. If under the night stars in the desert thou presently burnest mine incense before me, invoking me with a pure heart, and the serpent flame therein. Thou shalt come a little to lie in my bosom. For one kiss wilt thou then be willing to give all, but whoso gives one particle of dust shall lose all in that hour. Ye shall gather goods and store of women and spices, ye shall wear rich garlands, ye shall exceed the nations on earth in splendour and pride, but always in the love of me, and so shall ye come to my joy. I charge you earnestly to come before me in a single robe and covered with a rich headdress. I love you, I yearn to you, pale or purple, veiled or voluptuous, I who am all pleasure and purple and drunkenness of the innermost sense desire you. Put on the wings and arouse the coiled splendour within you. Come unto me. Nui is ever present, continuous and not needed to be mentioned in the Collects of Gnostic Mass, some say. Next one, no idea. Oh, here we are. Moriarty, very important psychologist chap that she worked so closely with, and as I say, they developed other treatments for people based on English myth, on Arthurian stuff, all the rest of it, and a lot of I did a paper on the novels of Dion Fortune, and I had to work with the characters with him because it was one of those talks. Either everybody's read them, so it would be boring as hell, or they hadn't read them, so I couldn't give away the endings. So I had to find what people look like, and I decided that he looked like Roy Marsden. So there we are. Right, he was 27 years older than Dion Fortune, and he was one of the significant men in her life. I mean, Crowley did very wickedly and very funnily say that Dion Fortune looked like a hippo with false teeth, but her brain attracted people, and as I say, Moriarty was 27 years older than her. He was a charismatic Irishman with a lifetime's travel, magic and things like that behind her, and she was a great part of the magical exploration that happened in the lodge he set up in Hammersmith. She came under psychic attack from an influential Indian theosophist, B.P. Wadia, and her inner voices told her to tell J.F.C. Fuller, Crowley's mate. And he listened politely, and then B.P. Wadia left the country a few days later, because presumably Fuller had a word. She joined the GD in 1919. Her mediumship got better and better, especially working with Frederick Bligh Bond. In 1922, Charles Thomas Loveday came into her life, his Nibs, as he was always known, and then he never left it. They were well met by moonlight in Glastonbury, and they just recognised each other at once. Now, who became which on the astral, I don't know. I'd have to reread the stuff. Dr. Penry Evans, Merlin, her Merle, was a Christian mystic in his suit, but he was a pagan in his birthday suit, basically. He gave her the elements, she gave him her spiritual contacts. She blossomed, the inner guides withdrew, and they enjoyed a wonderful flowering at the touch of a man during their marriage, and in all its sacredness. And then when a man has given a woman that flowering, no other woman can ever be to him what she is, she reckoned. Well, he divorced her and married somebody else. Merle's conflict was his career as a medical man and as a mystic, and he took 5 years to decide and got a lot of very good advice from beyond. They wanted to open a clinic with esoteric medicine on offer, spiritual, mental, magical and physical. They got the fraternity of Inner Light off the ground. Colonel Seymour came along, again he was Irish, again he was 20 years older than Dion Fortune. He worked diligently but was never truly part of the inner crowd really, and he left them eventually. Because he said that Dion Fortune's chanting had become too frequent and too much to bear. She also worked with the eminent scholar Bernard Bromage, who wrote on Egypt and things like that. And she then became unwell on the winter solstice of 1945, and she died on the 6th of January 1946 of acute myeloid leukemia. She worked with great personalities, and she established deep inner plane contacts. The safety of men 20 years older than her was important to her, but they were successful and they admired her enough to work closely with her. So she has no lasting regrets, I don't think, really. And then, that's Merle. Next one. And here we have the monster Mari Stopes. Dion Fortune's left a wonderful legacy for us because she was maternal to that extent. Crowley was the intellectual and synthesizer, if you like, and this one was the physical one of it. She was barely 5 foot tall, she was strident, ghastly, a very high achiever, not a team player, self-delusional, cruel, and we have so much to thank her for. She obviously thought that she was absolutely wonderful because it's not just a debate whether she forgot to put her petticoat on, she really did. She was vain could be, even to being a very old lady. And she used to be sort of a little frivolous person, you know, ever so girly. So large families run in families, and so did the rickets, the malnutrition, the TB, the poverty and the contempt from the middle and upper classes. Mari Stopes had no sympathy for any of these large families either, but firmly believed that the poor shouldn't be allowed to breed, as I said, really, because of the good quality of the race. She knew Sir Francis Galton, who'd argued for a national elite in mankind and coined the word eugenics. She, like Crowley, had an emotionally distant mother. Her mother was as cold as penguins' feet. She was a shocker. She was Scottish Presbyterian or whatever, incredibly clever, did the sciences variously. When she was going on honeymoon, she did a course in sort of geological strata or something, you know, unnecessarily worthy. And she was the first person to get a certificate for art to MA standard in Scotland, because women couldn't get educated properly, and because she could only get this one in art, she studied to diploma standard in 7 subjects, like experimental physics, and she was a suffragette and had started off as the daughter of an affluent greengrocer, a bit like Greg Wallace, really, but they were Quakers and then they turned into Congregationalists. His family had originally been affluent brewers, like Crowley's, and they, as I say, Mari Stopes' mother had an extended honeymoon, and she became pregnant, and they then had 2 daughters. They had Winnie, who just rolled over and gave in. She saw that she really couldn't compete, that she wasn't as bright as her mother, she wasn't as nasty as her sister, so she just dossed through life. She was one of these people who said, "Oh no, I can't do it, I've got a headache, sorry." And she was variously ill, and she was just a burden on the family and her friends all her life. So, you know, never kicked over the traces, just suffered through it. But I think I would have retreated from the Mari and her mum thing, really. She was a Libran, like Crowley, and she was born on the 15th of October 1880, 5 years and 3 days after Crowley. The parallels don't stop there, because Charlotte Stopes belonged to the Free Church of Scotland, and as I say, was a very narrow-minded sect. The Bible was all church 3 times on Sundays, and again, the father was the nicer one. He wasn't particularly nice, he was just a bit nicer. You know, they were unrelenting, really. She was incredibly worthy, and she made the girls wear advanced clothing in the mode of the Rational Dress Society, which is very interesting, but basically it said, take off your corsets, love, and just go freeform, just be comfortable about it. And you can see that appearing in the pre-Raphaelite stuff, you see it in the Golden Dawn, very, very, very important, all of that. So she threw away her corsets and her girls were put into loose-fitting knitted garments. Mari later dressed her own son in knitted kilts until his teenage years, so there would be no undue pressure on his genitals. Crowley was a kilt wearer in his Highland phase in the 1890s, and you know, women were doing bold things like wearing culottes. They were wearing split skirts that turned into trousers for their golfing, for their bicycling, and when they climbed the Alps. You know, there was this flip going on. She was, as I say, she was young and she was clever, and she read the whole of Swedenborg, the whole of Kant and Confucius by the time she was 18. What she didn't have was a sense of humour. She couldn't bear to be criticised, and she knew she was always right all her life, simple as. She had a lesbian lover or two, and one of them was a theosophist, but that was as close as she came to any sort of spiritual reaction with anything until she was a very old lady. She was frightening and clever and went to university and won a gold medal for botany and came second in zoology and came out with a first in botany and a third in geology in the end. And then her father died, and of cancer, as Crowley's had done. She became a paleobotanist and studied primitive plants hundreds of millions of years old. She went down mines. She insists that she stopped a miners' strike by just saying, no, enough, don't you dare, you know? And then went, ooh, scary lady. So they stopped. But her work was very, very interesting, very, very important. She went to the Antarctic, which I don't think Crowley ever did. She travelled extensively on her own because there was nobody as good as her, and she just sort of stomped off, you know, carrying a pack on her back kind of idea. She lived in Berlin and saw Isadora Duncan, whose secretary Mary Deste was a great friend of Crowley's, and she went to Japan, and she fell in love with a Japanese professor, and she was very, very glad that she'd never been kissed. She'd kept herself pure. Until she fell in love with this married professor of 37, and she was 23. She wrote her thesis in German and got a distinction for her doctorate, the first woman to do that. She was then appointed the first woman professor in Manchester in October 1904, which for me will always be the year of the Book of the Law, and everything else sort of filters around it, really. She was never one of us, and said, but as I think a worm would waste its time trying to understand sunsets, so I think we are absolutely incapable of understanding those above us and about the fate of us all. And this was in response to her Professor Fuji talking to her about Buddhism. Don't bother me with it. You know, are we ever going to know that? Not interested, not unless it's tangible, don't want to know. Crowley and Madeline Bennett had been in Ceylon to study Buddhism and found the local sect involved with a sexual devotional side to it. Crowley, of course, spent the first week or so in the brothels to sate his sexual appetites before he was then prepared to settle down and study it. Which is kind of sensible. Get the desire out of your system, and then you can work from there, really. Dion Fortune's young years were spent cracking up after being victimised by the head of college, as I said. Dion Fortune's name was Violet Firth, and Violets and then more Violets were her teenage poems. And Mari Stopes wrote a novel about her and Professor Fuji, and it is full of nerves and throbbing with desire. He talked divorce, and he was then the first man to kiss her. She was 25 and he was 39. She considered it as so binding an act as the equivalent of a marriage service. No sense of proportion at all, as I may have mentioned. He was a bit confused by her intensity because in Japan at the time, kissing only happened between a mother and a child. There wasn't even a word for adults kissing. But she wouldn't let him go, and she thought it was, quite a horrid experience. She went back to hockey, rowing, and pure science doctorate, which was higher than her German PhD. And she spent a lot of time looking down mines. And she then, but Fuji, she said, well, just leave your wife and your child. You don't need to see them again. They don't belong in our world together. Just abandon them. What's the problem there? Later on, but it carried on, this passion, after this one kiss. 2 years later, she wrote to him, to be kissed, I sometimes long so much that I take a girdle and bind it so tightly that I can hardly breathe around my waist, and then close my eyes and dream that it is your arms around me. Dear, I have never worn corsets, but this teaches me that this is why so many women have them very tight. It took her years and years and years to mature sexually, as you may guess. You may be ahead of me on that one. But within a month, she'd learnt enough Japanese to, travel alone and to go to no plays, which are the highly stylised dramas of Japan. Yeats wrote some, and then she wrote a book about them too, because she was a know-all. Eventually, after many years, she dropped the poor old professor and it just sort of fizzled out. She then took to her bed with a soaring temperature and 66 warts that suddenly smothered her. It might have been 666, but she was only 5 foot tall. And then she got better, and her 18 months in Japan ended. And back in England, she was recognised as being clever, an author of a popular book on botany, and a good dancer. Her new woman image was popular, and fluffy kitten, as she dressed to appear, this steely bisexual woman was a huge hit with other new women. She'd been as open as Crowley about her longings. In the new journal she wrote of a Japanese girl, "She had such lovely shoulders, I longed to be a man and marry her." Of another woman she said, "On her soft neck were the loveliest little blue veins. I never saw anything so suggestive of living marble. She was like white marble with an underflash of rose and violet. Why do I always fall in love with women?" This was literally unmentionable in intellectual circles in those days. Should we try another one? No? Oh yes. This is her. Lucinda Lambton. Think the brain of Mary Beard. Think of the eccentricity of Lucinda Lambton, who was this woman who used to do programmes on telly, saying of oddities she'd found. "Oh yes, I found this marvellous gentleman's lavatory, and in the cisterns are glass, and they've got goldfish in them." But with the force of Brian Blessed. She could just walk through a bloody wall if she wanted to. Right, next. There she is, being of her paleo-botanical self. This is in her house. Oh yeah, that's fine. So she'd attracted a guy who was engaged. So she told him he must break it off, basically. And his fiancée wrote to Mary asking if she loved him and wanted to marry him, and did he return her love, which is not unreasonable in the circumstances. Stokes wrote back to say she was terribly busy, but she took charge of the love triangle by trying to manipulate the other two. She said, "Send me your letters from him, and you send me her love letters to you, and I'll put them in date order, and we'll make some sense of this." And then she decided that there was no future in it for him, and really he should marry her. And bless the man, he did break it off, but it took him 3 months to say no, which I do like. Unlike Crowley, who consulted the I Ching, which said no, and did it anyway when he married his Nicaraguan firebrand and voodoo priestess, old de Miramar. She was fairly crazy, but he was no catch himself by then. Crowley's poetry is good and bad, sneered at and loved. Mary Stokes was always truly dire, but it didn't stop her publishing it. She thought whatever she did, she was the world's best at. It was as simple as that. Then many years later, Bosie Douglas of the Oscar Wilde fame wrote and said that she'd never write the perfect sonnet on a bus between meetings. Like Crowley, or maybe all Librans, she was spontaneous. She fell in love with a man perfect except for his nose and wanted to marry him. "You can see I'm a sudden person. In the middle of the ceremony, I may say no, so say yes to me now." He was a Canadian called Reggie Ruggles, I think. Yes, there we are. And a geneticist, and they did marry in March 1911 in Montreal. She believed that housework played havoc with highly strung women like herself, and that washing up was the hardest task in the house. Although they had a maid, he had to do the washing up. Yeah. She loved the novels of Maurice Hewlett, a romantic novelist that nobody's ever heard of now, and she used many of his themes in her Married Love, the book that made her famous and sold over 1 million copies. He was, he had just had to cope with this new woman, Brian Blessed type person that he'd married, and she kept her surname. She wouldn't become Ruggles, which was tough for him, really. And he said that if he'd known how ardent a feminist and suffragist she was, he would never have married her. As I say, he was a Canadian academic and he was quite an ardent suitor. They married in Canada and with huge sexual tensions between them, including him kissing her in public and putting his hand into her dress. It was a bit forward even now, really. She wanted a divorce which would be costly, and the grounds were almost anything that she could think of to keep the costs down. So she wrote to the Canadian Parliament and said, "Can I have a divorce, please?" And they said, "Yes, it'll cost you $1,500. And she said, "Thank you, I'll think again." So she thought again. I mean, she even offered to be seen to be committing adultery herself if it was cheaper than the $1,500. And you needed an act of parliament in Canada at that time to get a divorce anyway, you see. The basic troubles were sexual, as Reggie would indulge in hours of foreplay but couldn't get a real erection, so she felt drained and unsatisfied. Various biographers have said that she wasn't as ignorant of sex that she actually did need a respectable man to draw her a diagram of an erect phallus, and it wasn't until she saw that she realised that her marriage was unconsummated. That gave her the grounds for divorce. It's probably lies, but she got what she wanted. Where she was radical in her approach to birth control was her million-seller book Married Love, as it was the handbook to obtain sexual gratification and sustain romance in marriage from the woman's point of view in 1915. Now, this went on, as I say, it still sells. It's, you know, you can Kindle anything these days, you can Kindle that. And the early editions are good because it's obviously been revised over the years. Now, the women in the First World War did men's jobs for half men's pay. And there are things like the whole of Carmarthen, when the men were coming back from the war, just sacked every woman that had been working. But those women had been earning money for themselves. They had talked freely amongst themselves as they'd done the munitions and all the rest of it, and things were not the way they had been. Their skirts were shorter so they didn't cause damage in the factories. Their hair was shorter because it also made sense. They had been changed absolutely profoundly by all of this. Her book comes out and they all thought, well, blow me down. Have you seen this, Doris? This is dynamite. I'm not settling for him when he comes back. I'm not having any of that. We're going to do page 47. And it went on like that. She attacks sex scientifically through charts and diagrams and surveys. She found that nice women didn't have orgasms. She continued to believe that all girls of a superior class developed emotionally and sexually very late, as she had done, and that everything was filtered through her own experience. And she wrote an explicit description of sexual intercourse that the publishers and academic were equally frightened of. She also said that women's sexuality was as powerful and therefore as dangerous as a man's. She had to find a rich husband to back her book. She also said that they didn't just have to be victims of their husband's lust, which was another thing that was important, and you could say no. She dedicated the book to the young husbands, urging them to discover how to arouse and satisfy their wives. It took until 1918, I don't know if we've got another one, no, there we are. It was just as World War I ended that the Married Love appeared. Women over 30 who owned houses could now vote. As I say, there had been a whole social revolution. She kicked off the sexual revolution for everybody. But don't forget, it was for the purity of the white races. She didn't want rickety babies born who would stay illiterate. She wanted fine young men to go off to war. And it caused, endless fuss. I mean, people thought that it was a charter for prostitution. The trouble she had with the establishment was just absolutely staggering. I mean, even in the 1930s, she was getting letters from people saying that, thank you so much for my book, because people tended to get given it on marriage, very quietly. They were giving it on marriage. And people were saying, oh, thank you so much for telling me about that. I honestly thought that babies came as a result of earnest prayer. Well, earnest may have had something to do with it. But it was obscene. Real people, shunned her. She set up clinics for all of this. Her post bag was huge. She got 1,400 letters in the first 3 days of it being published. Her next book dealt with birth control, which was Wise Parenthood, which was about thwarting nature. And don't forget, in those days, contraception was quinine pessaries, Dutch caps, sponges filled with powdered soap, cotton wool smeared with Vaselines. Condoms were considered harmful. There were 2 anti-venereal disease societies that were very influential, and as the men came back from the war, something like 23% of them had a venereal disease. So these societies were set up, and one said all soldiers should be issued with antiseptic wipes and condoms. The other society said nonsense, our men shouldn't have to wear condoms, they'll come back from war effeminate. The royal family were automatically sent copies of her books when they got married. The Queen's father said, "Thank you very, very much, but we'll, turn our backs on that one." The Queen and Prince Philip said, "Thank you very much." They accepted graciously. So, next one. That's her husband. That's her second husband, Humphrey Verdon Rowe, who, that's her husband. And he again was a very nice chap who spent his fortune shoring up the birth control clinics and everything else as well. She treated him like absolute shit. She eventually made him write a letter because she'd fallen in love with somebody else. She dictated a letter to him saying, "Dear Mari, I'm a miserable worm. Everything that's wrong with our marriage is entirely my fault. You're sincerely your husband." I mean, words to that effect. So she could just dump him. They had one child, and who lived, and they had lifelong friends of the son had a lifelong friend, and she was the daughter of Barnes Wallis, the bouncing bomb man, and the kids eventually fell in love, and she wrote to her long-time friend, Dr. Barnes Wallis, saying, "Absolutely no way. Your daughter's defective. She wears glasses, and personally, I've always found her very dull socially." So, Barnes Wallis said, "Well, I wasn't particularly in favour of the young folk getting together so young, but now I am." They married, they lived together very happily, despite the fact that when they had their first child, Mari Stopes cut her son out of her will because he'd married a defective. Because she wore glasses. She was as full on as that. Aleister Crowley, so here we have them really. Crowley, who'd lived a life doing his will and finding out how hard it can be, but enabling other people to do theirs as well. Mari Stopes, who's very clever, very well travelled, and helped millions of people to take control of the fundamentals of their own lives. She improved health, wealth, and emotional scope on a global scale because she said, "Thou shalt not have too many children, but you are entitled to have fun." We have Dion Fortune, the only trained sexologist who brought compassion and a deep understanding of the innocent lives of people that can be in conflict with the way they present themselves to the wider world. She was the only one who wasn't a monster, but whereas the others told us what to do and how to do it, she had an understanding of our need for unity. She knew it in her heart, and we have an awful lot to thank all three of them for. Thank you.
Questions for Geraldine, or throw it open to anybody else that has things to say about women in Western Mystery tradition.
I've got about any of the ladies, so I just want to put that further to a shout out with William Seabrook. He also knew Gurdjieff, which I think is quite and gave us a good account of Gurdjieff and performances such as Dances of America in the 20s. So that makes him all the more unique character.
I'd completely forgotten that, but thanks for that. Yes, lovely.
And certainly the polarities that go back to Elik's Lugar. The whole idea of the polarities of male, female.
Oh yeah, I mean they go back way far really, but she wrote about them. The other person I could have mentioned was Anna Kingsford, about whom I know shockingly little, but Elaine knows loads. And she had sex on her wedding night, got pregnant, had hysterics, and never had sex again.
So one of my big asthma attacks, went home to mummy. And slept for the rest of the honeymoon, stayed with mummy, and then stayed with mummy until the baby was born. And so it was one night, one night stand, the wedding night.
Yeah, tried it once, didn't like it. Move on.
Just had an asthma attack, and husband probably thought she was having a lovely day.